In recent decades, the driving force of world economic development has been the spectacular growth of China in particular, and Asia in general. Between 1980 and 2020, a quarter of global GDP growth was attributed to China, outstripping the contributions of the United States 22%, European Union 12%, and Japan 4%. Between 2010 and 2020, when the United States and Europe were still recovering from the Great Recession, the world depended even more on China. During that decade, China's growth accounted for more than 40% of the world GDP growth. China's success story is related to its strong human resources, specifically the young workforce, plus the eagerness to explore opportunities in cities and special economic zones. Now that demographic advantage is gone, China's population is aging. Asia's largest country is expected to soon see a labor shortage. As China faces the above challenge, the economy will slow down and the size of GDP may shrink. The world will no longer depend on China to drive growth. What new growth engine will fill the void left by China? India is often mentioned, but that is an unlikely scenario because India has many problems of its own in terms of ethnicity, religion, and social inequality. India will also face a demographic problem as its birth rate is falling. In the coming years, perhaps the world will look to Africa for growth. According to recent UN estimates, Africa's population will increase from 1.4 billion people today to 2.5 billion in 2050. Meanwhile, China, Japan, Korea, and Europe will continue the downtrend and aging. The global economy will slow down unless hundreds of millions of young workers are added. Africa will add billions of workers, lost its health and flexibility, does not exclude the possibility of becoming the center of world economic growth. Over the next 30 years, China is projected to face unexpected demographic trends. The one-child policy has reduced the birth rate since 1980. The adult workforce will be reduced by 40% by 2050 compared with 2010, or 300 million people. The current workplace will age and the number of people 65 and older will double. It is almost impossible for China to change the situation despite various efforts and policies. Even in the coming years, there is an increase in births. It will take 20 years to have a positive impact on society. Now all eyes are on India, which may have surpassed China in population. However, this optimism still has many obstacles. India's population continues to grow not because of a high birth rate, but because of improved life expectancy. India is in the golden age of population, but it is also aging and the birth rate is getting lower and lower. In 1990, India's fertility rate was 4 children per woman. Now it is only 2. The United Nations predicts India's population, currently 1.43 billion, will increase to 1.61 billion by 2040, which means an additional 180 million people. But working-age people between 15 and 49 will account for less than a quarter of that increase, or about 43 million people. Meanwhile, the number of people aged 60 and over will increase by more than 100 million. This is unlikely to bring economic leverage. After 2040, India's workforce will begin to shrink along with China and a lot of other countries. Every report shows that in the next 20 years, most of the world will face a decline in the number of young people and a shrinking workforce, while caring for a bigger number of elderly people. With fertility rates ranging from 0.8 to 1.3 in East Asia, from 1.5 to 1.7 in Europe and the US, around 1.9 in Latin America, and now down to 2 in India. There is almost no region in the world where the birth rate has increased. Aging populations and reducing the workforce are almost inevitable trends for much of the world in the coming decades. The average fertility rate in Africa now is 4.3 children per woman, twice as much as the rest of the world. Such a high birth rate, in part, speaks to poverty and a lack of educational services. Some experts believe that as living standards and education improve, the fertility rate in Africa will decrease. Currently, Africa has the lowest schooling rate in the world, especially for girls. According to World Bank statistics, only 40% of girls in sub-Saharan Africa attend high school. Looking at the total of 54 African countries, in more than half of these, less than 20% of girls finish high school. In the 11 lowest countries, such as Ghana, Mozambique, or Niger, this rate is less than 10%. Experts predict that in 2023, 1 of 3 babies born globally will be born in Africa. The result is that by 2040, 1 in 3 people in the world between the ages of 15 and 24 will be in Africa. By 2050, Africa's working age population will be 5 times larger than Europe's and larger than India and China combined. A more detailed view from 2020 to 2040, the number of people of working age globally will increase by 428 million. Of these, 420 million are in Africa. The tiny number 8 million is in the rest of the world. African youth will account for 98% of total global workforce growth. In the West, these data and projections are often used to stoke fears of uncontrolled immigration or European society being overwhelmed by non-Europeans. African immigrants cause insecurity and disorder, disturbing many European values. However, in the future, Europe will have to think differently. African youth are not a threat, but a human resource that developed nations can rely on to keep factories running. In the 1980s, China was very poor, even less developed than Africa today. China's 1980 GDP was $423 billion, only slightly larger than the Netherlands. GDP per capita was $431 per year, half of what is Ethiopia today. Over the next 40 years, China increased its working-age population by 200 million, equipping them with the tools to work more efficiently, attracting global investment and expanding its economy 30 times. Of course, the difficulty is that the 54 African countries are quite divided, unable to unite together to create a miracle like China. In 1980, however, the idea that China would soon become an economy comparable to Europe or the United States was viewed as unrealistic. Another example is Bangladesh. Looking at the natural features, more than 100 million people crammed into narrow land, do not have many resources, and are often subject to natural disasters and floods. Economic development is almost hopeless. Even so, in the past 30 years, Bangladesh GDP has increased 5-fold. Their per capita income has caught up and gradually overtaken India. If Africa can achieve the same growth rate as Bangladesh in the next 30 years, it will contribute to additional $15 trillion to the global economy, equivalent to China's contribution in the period of 1980 to 2020. Expectations of such growth are not too illusory. From 1980 to 2020, Sub-Saharan Africa tripled its GDP from $600 billion to $1.9 trillion. Between 2000 and 2020, Nigeria's GDP has nearly tripled. Ethiopia's has grown 5-fold. If these countries can leverage the performance above and track on other African economies through deeper regional integration, the next generation of young Africans could create an economic boom and an engine of global growth. No other region in the world has as much growth potential as Africa. According to experts, the world economy needs Africa's growth, but should take a different path from China. The second biggest economy learns the industrial model of the West, which is to grow fast, build many factories to produce goods, which leads to mass pollution and takes a lot of resources to solve. For example, cleaning rivers and streams using so much coal and oil. China's economic success is also disastrous for the atmosphere. Since 2005, China has been the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Although Africa's CO2 emissions are very small now, if economic development is not sustainable, it could increase these dangerous greenhouse gases. Many experts argue that growth in Africa must be accompanied by a clean, green, and safe way, especially without damaging the natural landscape of ecological environment. Fortunately for Africa, this continent is diverse in hydroelectric, solar, wind, tidal, and geothermal. Countries can fully use technological advances to produce electricity from these resources, reduce energy prices, and create leverage for economic development. In some places, solar power has begun to be cheaper than coal-fired electricity. What is missing now is that Africa needs large electricity storage centers along with a secure transmission network. Experts say that natural energy in Africa, especially solar energy, is almost inexhaustible. Some African countries are also beginning to realize the need to develop green energy. The Kigali Communique, a document signed by 10 African countries in May 2022, has determined that the development of clean energy towards the cessation of coal and oil use is an irreversible process. Countries will combine all resources such as public, private, and foreign investment to continuously accelerate this process. Energy and environmental experts in Africa have proposed the creation of a Green Bank, an organization similar to the World Bank but dedicated to financing green energy projects in developing countries on loans at low interest rates. Today, most efforts to tackle climate change focus on reducing CO2 emissions from factories. Generating electricity from natural energy may be the easiest and closest way to climate goals. However, Africa's transition and development also has many obstacles. Much of the development aid to Africa has gone to waste. The reason is that they are invested in projects related to the interests of the leadership, instead of following the market and meeting the needs of the majority of the people. China's development experience may offer a number of lessons. For example, establishing special economic zones focusing on education, infrastructure, and improving international competitiveness for the business community. Countries can also build a model. The central government will hold the local government more responsible for the security and economic growth. African countries also need to cooperate with each other more to create a common investment environment, more integrated to attract capital from abroad. Charitable foundations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have demonstrated that relatively small amounts, but carefully managed, can produce great results in improving public health. Educational foundations, whether philanthropic or corporate, can provide similar benefits. Africa has great potential in attracting investment in sectors such as tourism, services, goods manufacturing, heavy industry, design, entertainment, retail, transportation, publishing, media, and finance. Of course, the biggest obstacle to Africa's development is internal strife, from civil wars to regional wars to genocide. The recent war in Tigray, an Ethiopian territory, may have killed nearly 1 million people, many times more than the number of victims in the Ukraine war. The civil war in Sudan for nearly 2 months has also resulted in thousands of deaths. The African Union, which brings together nearly 54 member states, needs stronger diplomacy to prevent and end conflicts. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan could not succeed economically without overcoming corruption, dictatorship, and bureaucracy. National unity and compromise between parties are vital to growth. Leaders who recognize this will see their economies outperform their neighbors and attract talent from across the continent as well as capital from around the world. The second obstacle comes from outside sources of capital. Over the past 20 years, Chinese enterprises have taken root in many countries, especially in the field of infrastructure development and mineral exploitation. Investments, concessional loans, or development aid from China are mainly directed towards corrupt countries with poor governance As a result, they quickly run out of money and fall into a debt trap. The International Monetary Fund has repeatedly visited and urged Chinese authorities to embark on debt restructuring, debt reduction, or debt forgiveness for Africa. Otherwise, all the meager tax dollars earned by these countries will be used to pay interest. As a result, there are no resources to invest in education, health, or social development. The problem of poverty is hopeless to resolve. Once again, the issue of fighting corruption, waste, and bureaucracy is at the forefront when considering the factors affecting growth. So far, Africa has been viewed through the lens of its colonial past, poverty, and instability. Few people think about future potential. Demographic trends now put Africa first and the only place that can sustain growth for the world. Africa needs global attention, not just as support, but because this continent is very important. This has come to an end of our program today. Thanks for your attention and see you next time.